Our topic today is not just simply about COVID-19, but what the heck happened. We're going to talk about Twitter files, censorship, and a story that, quite frankly, you'll never believe.
A clear path forward requires looking back and learning. Good public policy requires human connection. It's a consideration of the facts, applying common sense, and innovation. It's urban, it's rural, it's real life. We all have something to contribute. We all have a responsibility to get informed because there's a little piece of Canada in all of us, isn't there? Let's learn on this path together. This is Leaders on the Frontier.
Well, I'm very excited to have today with us two preeminent scientists in the world, quite frankly, in public health. Dr. Jay Bhattacharya is a professor at Stanford University Medical School. He's a physician, epidemiologist. He's also a health economist and also a public health policy expert focusing on infectious diseases and vulnerable populations. And then we have Dr. Martin Kulldorff. He's a professor of medicine at Harvard. He's a biostatistician and epidemiologist with expertise in detecting and monitoring infectious disease outbreaks and vaccine safety evaluations. And if that was not enough, he's also a senior fellow at the Brownstone Institute. And quite frankly, they're also not only smart, but they're also my friends. So I'm delighted to welcome them here today.
Thank you, David. So good to be here.
I would like to introduce this next clip. This clip is in the House of Representatives where Congresswoman Nancy Mace, and I believe she's from the state of South Carolina, is frankly grilling former Twitter executives about their censorship of very important health information that matters to all of us.
Apparently, the views of a Stanford doctor are disinformation to you people. I, along with many Americans, have long-term effects from COVID. Not only was I a long hauler, but I have effects from the vaccine. It wasn't the first shot, but it was the second shot that I now developed asthma that has never gone away since I had the second shot. I have tremors in my left hand, and I have the occasional heart pain that no doctor can explain, and I've had a battery of tests. I find it extremely alarming Twitter's unfettered censorship spread into medical fields and affected millions of Americans by suppressing expert opinions from doctors and censoring those who disagree with the CDC. So my first question this morning of Ms. Gaddy, may I ask of you, where did you go to medical school?
I did not go to medical school.
I'm sorry?
I did not go to medical school.
That's what I thought. Why do you think you or anyone else at Twitter had the medical expertise to censor a doctor's expert opinion?
Our policies regarding COVID were designed to protect individuals. We were seeing...
You guys censored Harvard-educated doctors, Stanford-educated doctors, doctors that are educated in the best places in the world, and you silenced those voices. I have another tweet by someone with a following of a full 18,000 followers. This person put a chart from the CDC on Twitter. It's the CDC's own data, so it's accurate by your standards. And you all labeled this as misleading. You're not a doctor, right, Ms. Gaddy?
No, I'm not.
Okay. What makes you think you or anyone else at Twitter have the medical expertise to censor actual, accurate CDC data?
I'm not familiar with these particular situations.
Yeah, I'm sure you're not. But this is what Twitter did. They labeled this as inaccurate. It is the government's own data. It's ridiculous that we're even having to have this conversation today. It's not just about the laptop. This is about medical advice that expert doctors were trying to give Americans because social media companies like Twitter were silencing their voices.
Okay, that clip is so powerful at so many levels. First of all, I should just tell you that Congresswoman deserves a medal for her approach with those former Twitter executives. And it's almost comical in a dark way that they're talking about two physicians, namely you, Jay, and namely you, Martin. They talked not only about the Stanford physician, Dr. Jay Bhattacharya yourself, but also it was funny in the background. I don't know if you noticed this, but there's a sheet of communications that's going on that is from you, Dr. Martin Kulldorff. So when you see that clip, what do you say? What goes through your mind?
Well, that clip was from a tweet that was censored where I said that it's important to vaccinate older high-risk people, but if you have had COVID, you don't need a vaccine, and if you're young, you don't need it. So that's accurate information, and it's pretty astonishing that somebody who knows nothing about public health decides what to censor or what not to censor.
Yeah, it's
And
frankly gobsmacking.
and whether, I mean, the government was pushing the social media companies to do censoring on their behalf. But even if that wasn't the case, it's still bad for social media to censor, because that kills. It kills people who
Exactly.
censor.
They
And
were actively censoring. What about you, Jay?
I mean, I completely agree with Martin. The West has prided itself forever on our fundamental value that we support the free exchange of ideas. This wasn't a conversation about. This wasn't things that probably ought to be left off of social media. It wasn't child porn. It wasn't violent threats. What it was a legitimate scientific discussion, a legitimate public health discussion by professionals in the field taking place in public on social media. And social media companies, Twitter, Facebook, Google, Reddit, you name it, took sides. They decided, based on no real argument, just simply raw power, that we were saying dangerous things, even though what we were saying was rooted in the scientific evidence. Um, you know, Martin mentioned something very important. The government played a tremendously important role in this social media censorship. I don't believe they did it on their own. I believe it was actually the result of direct orders from the federal government in the United States, from the U.S. federal government. And I know this because Martin, and I are involved in a case brought by the Missouri Attorney General's office against the Biden administration. This case, the judge has permitted us to depose Tony Fauci, to read government email communications with Twitter, Facebook. It is a shocking picture, David, of government officials, including within the high inside the Biden White House, effectively threatening Facebook, all these like social media companies, that if they didn't abide by the censorship demands, including lists of people to censor, ideas to censor, then they would lose their sort of legal protection against being called a publisher, which would subject
Wow.
to legal threat. I mean, it was basically a government propaganda campaign, and the censorship was a tremendously important part of that. And the reason why it was done is because the government policy, which was so draconian, so out of line with previous practice, required that the public think that there was a consensus, a scientific consensus in favor of it, when there actually wasn't. It was an
Exactly.
illusion. The censorship was in service of creating an illusion of consensus that never existed.
Wow. I think so many people would be shocked to hear this. In fact, today, it's hard in many respects that many of the mainstream media don't even talk about this story. So, in this situation, we have why is this relevant to Canadians? I think it's directly relevant because so much of our information and news is driven out of social media, out of the United States. And also, so many of the mainstream media in the United States drive so much of the narrative, not just in Canada, but frankly, around the world. So, this kind of high degree of censorship is really gobsmacking. And it did not allow for a free and open discussion regarding basic facts and evidence that people to this day are struggling to find out about, like even natural immunity. It's incredible. I should also point out that in Canada, some 2,000 media outlets are funded by the federal government, and they have to sign agreements to cover certain issues in different ways, and that is incredibly undermining in terms of their ability to be journalists and not just simply carrying propaganda for the state. I mean, this is how I look at this now, and this is for me has been a very powerful revelation. Has that been for you as well, Jay and Martin?
I think the media has failed, not just in Canada, but certainly in the US and in Western Europe. So that's for sure. In Canada, there's also been a campaign against the medical doctors who told the truth about this issue of the pandemic. where they have been threatened to lose their medical license. One example is a very brave physician in Toronto named Kulwinder Kaur, and she's been very brave. She has sort of talked about focus protection and tried to disseminate accurate information about COVID and the pandemic, and they went after her medical license. So
Wow.
that should never happen. That's very totalitarian regime who does those things, not a free
Exactly.
society.
What about you, Jay?
I mean, one thing that happened in Canada to us after we wrote the Great Barrington Declaration, David, the CBC did this very scurrilous roundtable featuring some scientists who disagreed with us, who essentially mischaracterized our proposal. They said that we wanted to let the virus rip and we wanted to kill people effectively on CBC. There was a lawyer that contacted us that helped us file a complaint to the ombudsman of the CBC, who effectively said it was fair. We didn't deserve a response. I was never contacted by the CBC to be on there and to reply. Martin wasn't, neither was Sunetra Gupta. Essentially, the Canadian people was fed a propaganda point. The idea that the lockdowns were the only way, that it was the standard science, and that anyone else disagreeing with them was dangerous pseudoscientists or fringe epidemiologists, if you will, to coin a term. The media essentially propped up the government narrative, even though the government narrative was not rooted in the scientific data.
Yeah, no, it's truly outrageous what's happened. So I think we want to challenge our fellow citizens, no matter where they are in the United States or in Canada, to really take a critical view of the information that's been given them and not fall for, quite frankly, as you say, just mimicking a narrative that was utterly false. So speaking of narrative, one of the points of information had to do with the origins of COVID-19. I remember specifically having debates with persons saying that it was all a, quote, conspiracy theory to think that somehow this virus, one of the options that was viable at the time was that it came from a laboratory, a class 4 lab in Wuhan, China, of all places. And that, in fact, it came from a wet market from some type of bat soup or something like that. But now we have the receipts. We have information, report after report, not just simply from the Department of U.S. Energy, but from the FBI, of all places, including the Central Intelligence Agency, where the virus came from. But it's almost like they are reluctant admissions of a fact that has been well established now for quite some time. So is that important information? And what does that tell you, Martin? What is that significant as another point of information that we know now to be correct in terms of the origins of the virus?
Obviously, it's a very important question, both for prevention of future pandemic, but also in terms of the reputation of the scientific community. If it was scientists responsible for this, that doesn't reflect very well on scientists. Now, I'm an epidemiologist and a biostatistician, a public health scientist, so I don't have the expertise to judge where the virus came from, and I need to sort of focus on those areas where I have some knowledge. So I can't opine on that, but that's also an example where the discussion about it was censored. It was swept under the rug, and that should never happen.
Exactly. So what do you think, Jay?
I mean, I think there are scientists on both sides that are debating whether it came from a lab or was natural origin. I have to say, in looking at the debate, what I notice is the same pattern that happened with lockdowns. There's a central sort of narrative with well-funded government scientists funding virologists who worked on what I think is probably dangerous experiments to augment the capacities of viruses like the SARS virus. They're the ones who are saying that it was obviously a natural origin. And for a year, almost or longer, they use the media to create this idea that if you thought it was a lab leak, it was a conspiracy. You can look at documents from the earliest days of the pandemic where the head of the National Institute of Health, Francis Collins, and Tony Fauci are writing to each other. And when the suggestion comes up that it might have been a lab leak, and in fact that the United States government may have actually supported the lab where the leak likely happened, if it happened, then they work to cover that idea up. They use their muscle inside the scientific literature to create this idea that it's established but beyond any reasonable doubt that it was natural origin. They essentially created again an illusion of consensus around a scientific point where there was no consensus. It's the same exact dynamic they use with the lockdowns. They use their raw power to wrangle the scientific community, to wrangle the media, to wrangle even the government itself in support of maybe a false narrative.
So it's really quite ironic that you have senior people in these positions of government authority, frankly, undermining the scientific process in the sense that science should be about seeking truth, should be keeping open-minded about options and analysis, and seeking, again, the truth for the benefit of society. But instead, they weren't doing that. They were trying to push a specific narrative. Is that right, Martin?
I think that's right, and that's very troublesome. It goes against the whole principle of science. And if we don't change that, we will have seen the end of the Age of Enlightenment after about 500 years.
Exactly.
So I blame the scientific leaders a lot, because I don't blame regular citizens, because they were fed one thing. So it's not strange that they believed that lockdowns would work, that they were consensus, even though there wasn't. So I don't blame regular citizens for what happened. I do blame leading scientists who shut down the debates and who pushed their narrative. And it's very strange because Francis Collins and Anthony Fauci in the US, they are both lab scientists. They don't know much about public health, but they were the one who was leading the public health response, even though they don't know much about it. I also blame journalists, because it's the job of journalists to actually do inquire and try to find different viewpoints and expose them and critically evaluate them. And of course, it's also responsibility of politicians to listen to everybody and then to see what makes more sense. Like during the Second World War, Churchill is famous for he had his generals there arguing with each other. What was the best approach? And that's what Trump and Biden and Trudeau should have been doing. They should have gotten in people with different views, different public health science with different views, and then hear them out and have them argue with each other.
It's almost like there's a perfect storm here. We have institution after institution that didn't seem to be doing their job, asking, as you say, what those critical questions were, having that kind of fulsome debate in a respectful way, but that would actually frankly, it seemed like so many people weren't doing their job. It wasn't just, universities or public health officials or politicians. People seem to be afraid. So how did this just happen overnight, Jay?
I mean, I think the key element, if I had to pick one, is fear. And we're as humans built to fear infectious diseases. I mean, it's like built into our like lizard brain almost. Now, what happened during the pandemic was that governments used that built-in psychological aversion, this fear of pathogens, and amplified it. Right? The messaging from government after government was that COVID was a unique threat to every single person equally. The governments used this fear. Public health used this fear, and why did they do it? What they will say is that they used it because they wanted everyone to take the virus seriously. But in fact, what the end point was essentially compliance with the orders that the public health was giving. I think that's, if I had to peg the cardinal sin of public health, because I mean, from my view, Um, I had thought that public health had had eschewed those kinds of techniques, that you would never ever engage in fear mongering, in creating divisions between people, to essentially to label others as unclean.
Never seen this before. I've never seen it before. Have you?
Well, I mean, I think you could point to the early days of HIV, maybe where there was there was stigmatization of people. I mean, there was a lot of stigmatization of people in the population. Public health actually played some role in that, but like finally work to counter it. Um, but I think in here, public health played a tremendously destructive role. Like public health spread the idea that other humans were biohazards, and we need to avoid the biohazard if we wanted to live. That is a tremendous, for civilizations, it's tremendously destructive to have that idea at large.
So, Martin, if we looked at this situation, how do we prevent this from ever happening again? Are there basic advice and recommendations that you would have so that we do not experience this again as a Canadian society, indeed a world?
I think it's important that the public at large realizes and understands that this was the biggest public health fiasco in history. I don't trust that the politicians or the public health officials or the media is not going to do the same mistake again. What did change things eventually during this pandemic was the public, the truckers in Canada, but not just the truckers, many others as well. That's what's changed the whole narrative. And so I think that's what we have to rely on, the public, to where there is sanity, where there is common
Wow.
sense, and who actually understands that natural immunity exists. If you've had measles, you don't get measles again. If you've had COVID, you might get it again, but it won't be in a serious manner. And we've known that for 2,500 years, and the public still knows it, but the public health establishment forgot about it for 3 years, and they are sort of now slowly waking up from their dream of ignorance.
Wow. Well said, Martin. And it's fascinating. You said something very interesting. And I don't know if our viewers would know this, but you are originally from Sweden. You live in the United States. You're a prominent health official. And you said something very interesting. You said that the truckers' convoy in Canada made a difference.
It was impossible to ignore, and they were scientifically correct, while the public health officials were not.
They were following the science.
Yes, they are not only following the roads, they're also following the science.
So this is quite an irony, as our prime minister emphasized this time and time again. We're trying to follow the science, even though they introduced a mandate on a population, namely independent truckers who did not move about. They were isolated in their cabs generally. Most of the time, there wasn't any scientific evidence that we're still not aware of that would justify such a divisive type of mandate that would threaten their livelihoods. So
And
this
my
is quite
conclusion is
interesting.
that the trackers are both smart, but also very well educated. And I can imagine why, because they sit there in the tracks all day and they listen to podcasts or other things. So I think they are very well informed about what's going on in the world.
Wow, what a great insight. How would you respond to what advice would you have for us, Jay, as we work to try to get on a path of healing and prevent this from happening again?
I mean, David, every institution failed. I was involved with a couple of major court cases in Canada, and it was frankly shocking to see like how difficult it was for even high justices to look at the scientific evidence
Mhm.
squarely when it contradicted government policy and government scientists, even when the government scientists were just wrong on the facts. Now, you wouldn't normally think of courts as a place where like basic fundamental rights would be protected, right? So basic civil rights, basic right to travel within one's own country would be protected. The right to hold religious ceremonies that are important for your life, the right to speak, and yet courts in Canada fail to do that over and over and over again. The Canadian, and this I just shouldn't just say Canada. That happened in the United States, happened all over the world. Um, the media failed. right? They didn't ask basic questions. The scientists and public health authorities failed. The government failed to respect the basic rights. Take the truckers. The leaders of that trucker movement had their bank accounts seized for the crime of holding a protest. How is that consistent with living in a free society? I think Canada has a tough road ahead, David, and I don't know how to repair all of it. I don't think anybody does, but I do think that we have to keep speaking out, and hold fast to the scientific truths, the truths we have about civil liberties, the truths we know about pandemic management, and public health. All of that we have to keep saying over and over again until there is reform, so that we can get back to our great civilization. We can't let the Enlightenment end. I mean, that's essentially Martin says that it sends chills up and down my spine. The Enlightenment is the basis for so much of our civilization. And if we are now in an age where essentially we can let biological risks overturn every single commitment we have to each other, I think it's a very, very dangerous time.
Well said, Dr. J. Bhattacharya and Dr. Martin Kulldorff. Thank you so much for being with us today in this far-reaching conversation about lessons learned from COVID-19. We thank you so much for your courage and your commitment to the truth, and as we walk on this journey together. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
So that brings to a close our discussion today about COVID-19. We're so glad that you could join us, and be sure to continue to keep in touch with the Frontier. Please subscribe to our newsletter and check out our website at www.fcpp.org for more information.
Thank you for watching Leaders on the Frontier. We're a nonpartisan think tank. We explore ideas, policy, and practical solutions that can make a difference in the lives of Canadians. We do not accept any government funding. We work for you. Thank you for supporting Frontier. Visit fcpp.org to give. While you're there, be sure to check out our latest articles and research. Without open discussion and debate, you're not thinking, nor are you free. Comment below. We'd love for you to join the conversation.